Okay, well, thank you for having me. I got you got the basic biography already, but I'll just add a little bit to that. I really feel that, based on my background, that I'm kind of one of those bridge people between cultures. I feel really comfortable in America as an American. Have no problem here. Got the benefit of an excellent education here in Boulder County, and certainly, don't have any problem calling myself 100% American. At the same time, I'm also Lebanese, and I feel comfortable in Lebanon, in the Arab world. I speak Arabic. You can see the way that I look, that I walk around in the Middle East and nobody bats an eye. I'm fully Lebanese as well. And so I'm one of those people that can help bring some understanding between these two different worlds. And as we know, right now, we have a lot of tension between these two different worlds. And so I want to help bring some perspective into kind of some of the media madness that we have right now around the issues of Muslims, Arabs, America, and some of these subjects. And what I really want to point out this morning, or I guess it's not morning anymore, but what I'd really like to point out is that we have this very black and white media landscape around the issue of Arabs, Muslims, immigration, and so on. And there's two camps. And the one camp tells us Islam is a religion of peace. Islam is a religion of peace. There is no problem. All of this stuff that's going on in the headlines that we see is just an aberration, and it really has nothing to do with Islam. And I believe that's not the whole picture. At the same time, on the other side of the media landscape, we have messages that are intended to make you afraid, and that they are preaching fear, and they are preaching anger. And that also is not the whole picture. And what I want to try to do today is to get us to look inward at what are some of our reactions and how they might be colored by this media landscape, and to really think through that and not just operate on a gut reaction level, because I think that really does a disservice to our country and to the things that we're trying to accomplish, and also to us as people. Living in fear or anger about things based on a distorted media message is not good. It's not good for us. And so I think there are really three reactions that I identify among Americans, especially from my background as a Christian. In the Christian churches, I see this a lot. I see these three different reactions to Islam, to Muslims, and related to the issue of immigration. The first one is fear. And there are lots of good reasons maybe to be afraid, but I want to argue that ultimately there are a lot more reasons not to be afraid. And we can't let fear control us or dictate our actions. So, the phrase Islamic terrorism, those two words are often associated with each other. And terror, is a synonym for fear. So Islam and fear, they go together. And a lot of this has to do with history. 9/11 is still really big in a lot of our minds. We are aware of the horrible things that happened there and the association with Islam. But there are other reasons. I mean, even more current things. Right now, what's going on in ISIS, we have a group which has taken control of territory, declared a country. They literally traffic in human slaves, in sexual slavery. They are killing people. They are imposing a law which is abhorrent and brutal. And this does make people afraid. And so fear is one of those reactions that we have to a threatening situation. And the other one, of course, we have the fight and flight. So the other one is what I call fury. So fear and fury. So fury, I'm sure you've all seen. Does anyone want to go on record and just say that they have some fear when it comes to Islam? Should we just be real with one another here? Yeah, so there's some fear. Fury, is anybody angry about Islam? Let's just be honest. I have some anger about Islam. When it comes down to it, so my family, we left the Middle East because of war, partly. We were not able to go back to Lebanon when we were out of Lebanon because of war. And so we ended up coming to the United States. And I thank God that the borders were open and that we were able to come from that region. I was born as an American citizen because of my mother, but many other families in that same situation didn't have that privilege and have become Americans over those decades. And that anger that people feel over some of these things in the history is understandable. And it is something that I've experienced too. And even if you're not angry about things that have happened to you personally, if you're not a little bit angry about some of the exploitation, about the way women are treated in parts of the Middle East, about some of these major issues, then maybe you're not paying attention. So my point for both fear and fury is not that you shouldn't at all experience those emotions, but my point here is, can we put it into perspective? And I'll get to what I believe our reaction ought to be, and particularly as a Christian. And the third reaction, I think, is one that, I live in Boulder, and this is a reaction that we get most in the more liberal parts of our country, and that's what I call fascination. So there's a fascination with Islam. And this fascination tends to be around these cultural issues. So we have a group of people that are different from us, so there's an interest and wanting to understand and wanting to root for the underdog in some way, because in much of the world, Muslims are kind of seen as the underdog. And so for some of us, in the more liberal side, and there's this desire to kind of see the best and to believe the best about people. And so that leads people to saying things like, well, Islam is a religion of peace, against all evidence that there might be some problems within that group of people. And it's an enormous group of people, and they certainly don't all think alike, and they certainly don't all believe the same thing. But we tend to begin painting with a broad brush if we're kind of captivated by that fascination with Islam, and we begin to say, no, there's no problem here. They're good people, and certainly many of them are. They're peaceful people, and certainly many of them are. And so we just paint with that broad brush, and that fascination leads us to uncritically accept that worldview, or to not be able to have a conversation about what might be wrong in that community. And so those three reactions, fear, fury, and fascination, I think they all have a basis in truth, but they're not the totality of what's true. And what I really believe as a Christian, I'm going to speak as a Christian now for a moment, is that the real reaction that we ought to have towards Muslims is that of love. And I believe that love is powerful. I think it's more powerful than hatred. I think fear has driven, groups within our country to do hateful things, to burn Qurans, to try to incite, anger, to use words and language that I actually find very un-American about immigrants. And so I believe that our reaction, rather than being dictated by fear or fury or fascination, ought to be dictated by love. But let me tell you what I mean by love. Love is, a lot of things to a lot of people. We use the same word to describe how we feel about ice cream and how we feel about our football team and how we feel about the people closest to us in our lives. And so obviously that word is very broad. But let me bring out 3 elements of that in particular. And the first one, I believe, is gentleness. And that one may be the one we associate most with the word. We have a very ungentle, ungenerous, unkind stream within our reaction towards people from other nations, particularly the Arab world. And that, I believe, is not an American value, is not an American trait. We have a lot of talk about walls and about excluding people, and that has never been what has made America great. What has made America great in the past has been openness to the immigrant, the tired, the poor, the masses yearning to be free. And so taking that high road is one element, I think, of how we have to respond as Americans to this refugee crisis that we do have. And that's in direct response to that trend of anger. We need to have gentleness. At the same time, we need to have truth. Truth is an element of love. If you have a person in your life that, let's say, is struggling with an addiction or is struggling with an issue, it is not loving to that person to just ignore the problem. It might be easier, but it is not actually loving. So as a Christian, I'm commanded to love my neighbor and even to love the stranger, as it says in the Bible in numerous places. But as a Christian, love, part of that is by being truthful to others. And I think we do have to have, balancing that gentle, generous approach, we do have to have a truthful approach. We do have to consider the facts in a rational way and not be not paint with that broad brush. Okay, so when we look at the Middle East, there are so many different kinds of people in the Middle East. And we certainly don't need to be fearful and angry of all of them, or even of very many of them. It's a relatively small minority, but we need to be truthful. That minority exists. And they're very significant in their influence, and certainly their actions and their beliefs are intense. And so we do have to be truthful about that. We do have to consider that rationally. And that is part of being loving towards others, is to be truthful about it and to call it out as a fact. And there's been too much glossing over the truth of what problems there really are. And the last one, instead of fear, I believe we need confidence. We need boldness. That is also an element of love. I think as Americans, when we become overcome by fear, we begin to act in ways that are not in our wheelhouse. They're not the way we as Americans deal with problems. We get dragged off of our high ground and we get dragged into the mud. And that's what's happening with fear. We need a boldness to say, look, we believe in our values. We believe in our nation. We believe in our God. And we think that by being generous and by being open-armed, that this is actually the most powerful strategy that we could have. And when we become reactionary and we start to make decisions based on that fear, we lose that moral high ground. And so that confidence that we need to have, that is an aspect of being open-armed and being loving towards the world, that ultimately is the most powerful way that we could respond. So in terms of those 3 reactions, I think the answer to all of them is really the same. And it's that we really need to consider these people over there these refugees that want to come here, we need to consider them as human beings. We need to engage them with an attitude of compassion, to think about the struggles and the difficulty that they face, and to remember that we as Americans have this tradition that has made us great of opening our arms to people in those kinds of desperate situations. Now, I want to bring up three things, and I want to ask what you think they have in common. Ferris wheels, ice cream cones, and John Elway. What do they have in common? Joy. Any answers? Joy. Okay, yes. Love and joy. Okay, Ferris wheels, ice cream cones, and John Elway. They all bring up love and joy. There's another thing they have in common. These are all things which we would not have as Americans if we did not have Arab Americans. It was Arab Americans that invented the Ferris wheel and the ice cream cone. And John Elway's family long ago immigrated here from the Middle East. And there's other things too, like Steve Jobs. The Ford Motor Company was in a really desperate situation when they had an Arab American CEO that turned things around. John Sununu in a group of Republicans, you might know that name. There are lots of wonderful contributions by Arab Americans. And so what I'm trying to bring up here is that as we close our borders, we're closing our nation to ice cream cones, Ferris wheels, and John Elway of the future, and Steve Jobs, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Arab Americans have been an enormous part of our nation's success and history. It's kind of hidden in there because we don't think of Ferris wheels as an Arab American thing. We think of them as an American thing, and that's what happens when immigrants come and assimilate. And so, as we close down out of our fear and out of our anger, as the way that we engage the world changes, it really has a cost to us. And the cost, I just tongue-in-cheek, Ferris wheels, ice cream cones. And there's many other much more significant contributions, of course. But that is, those are the kinds of things that we're all about. We're all about, as a nation, inviting and welcoming the immigrant. So I want to also bring up and mention what my family is doing in the Middle East. So we're Americans, and we moved to Boulder. It's been more than, it was 28 years ago that we moved to Boulder, and my brother went to University of Northern Colorado, married an Arab American girl, and then in the course of our ministry, Christian ministry around the world, we began the process of opening a center in Beirut. And now the original plan that our family had for this center was that it would be a safe house for people who were coming out of Islam and becoming Christians. So people from Saudi Arabia, people from Iraq, people from Egypt, people from all over North Africa and other parts of the Middle East, when they become Christians from out of a Muslim background, a lot of times they face a great deal of persecution, sometimes from their own family. Sometimes not, by the way. Sometimes the family doesn't seem to mind at all, but quite often there is a great deal of persecution. And so our idea, or our plan, was to open this safe house where people could come into kind of more of a neutral space. Lebanon has a large Christian minority, and so there was a space for that. And to give them a place to kind of get established, find work, learn more about their Christian faith, and start a new life. That wasn't geared towards bringing them towards the United States, but it was geared towards helping them to find another space in their lives where they could live their new faith. But no sooner had we basically gotten that thing started as the refugee crisis in Syria began to develop. And so very quickly we were inundated and flooded with people in great need. And so we changed gears and we began to meet those needs. Some of the needs are very simple. A lot of people just need someone to talk to. They really just need someone to cry with them and sit with them and listen to them about the fact that they've lost the where they grew up. They've lost a sense of their country. They've lost a sense, they lost their work. They maybe have lost family members, maybe a spouse, maybe children. And so just to even have a place where they could have someone pray for them and someone listen to them and someone cry with them. And so very quickly, among this group of refugees, we began hiring Christians that were maybe pastors back home, maybe counselors, maybe school teachers, and just bringing them on staff and helping them deal with this human crisis. I should have prepared the statistics, but the number of people, millions and millions of people. I do know that we have accepted about, in the United States, I think there's about 20,000 Syrian refugees that have ended up here one way or another. Most of them may have already had green cards or may have already had visas for different reasons and did end up here, or they had American relatives and they were able to come in that way. But Lebanon, my other country, has a population of about 3.5 million. We have about 2 million refugees. So the number of refugees, the impact that had on Lebanon was enormous. But we began to also find lots of other very practical, serious needs that needed to be met. We have, people need food. People need to find a place to stay, a shelter. And so we began to try to help with this. And what was amazing is that the Christians of the Middle East, who have been for many generations in a position of very serious subjugation, very serious threat, quite often, opened their doors. The churches were overflowing with refugee families. Regardless of whether they were from Muslim background or Christian background, the churches opened their doors and began to take care of these needs. Now, among these 2 million Syrian refugees that ended up in Lebanon, there were hundreds of thousands of children. Now, children not going to school is not a good thing, and so the churches began to set up impromptu schools right there in their buildings and began to teach. And so we have also done that. We have a school which we've started. We are snapping up teachers anywhere we can find them and putting them in front of 100 kids. And hey, let's have a class here. And while we teach them the basics, basic educational subjects, we also have had an opportunity in Lebanon to teach children the basics of Christianity. And we've had hundreds and hundreds of families become Christians as a result of this. Let me give you a little bit of understanding of why that might be the case. For many in the Muslim world, they have a understanding or a knowledge or a desire to please God. They do believe in God and they want to please God, and they've been doing their best within their religion to do that. But at the same time, events in the world have affected them deeply. And when they look at ISIS, they say, if that's Islam, we don't want any part of it. How could it be from God? And that has caused many people to question their religion. At the same time, they look at Europe and they look at what they see coming out of America in terms of media, and they say they see godlessness, they see immorality, they see a way of life that they don't want. And so they feel caught in between the secular West and the extremist religion that they see represented in some of in things like ISIS. And so there's really no way for them. But when they hear a message about a traditional kind of Christianity where God loves them and God asks them to love one another, that's very appealing. And so there have been hundreds. At this point, we are baptizing hundreds of people every week. It's an enormous, enormous shift. And what we're seeing in the Middle East is where there used to be 1 or 2 or 3 converts in a country in a year, we're now seeing, as I mentioned, thousands every month. And that is having a huge impact. Today in Iran, we don't think of Iran as a hotbed of Christian activity, but today in Iran, there is somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million Christians that are new converts from Islam. That is an enormous demographic change that is going to have serious repercussions in the Middle East in the future. It's not really reported on widely. There's not a lot of those people that stand up and want to tell their story because they're afraid to some extent, but there are some. And you can find their stories on YouTube and covered in the Middle Eastern media. And so this is a quiet groundswell and shift that's been happening. And you know, a lot of the people that are leading that movement became Christians here in America. A lot of them are Arabs who came here for school, for work, for opportunity, became Christians, and have a heart for their people back home and are taking that message of the Christian gospel back to the Middle East. If we shut the door to immigrants, there are lots of unintended consequences. People like that will not have that opportunity to change the world in that way. Before I sit down and shut up, I do want to tell one other story, and it is the negative side of immigration. And it's a story that happened very close to here in Greeley, Colorado in the 1950s. Greeley, Colorado, has a reputation of being a cow town now, doesn't it? But if you could imagine what it was like in the 1950s, I'm sure it was quite a bit more of a cow town then. But they had a university, and at the university, there were a number of international students, and one of them was a young man from Egypt by the name of Said Qutb. Has anybody heard that name? You might know what I'm telling you. You might know the story that I'm telling. Said Qutb was a young man who came to study at the university that's now called the University of Northern Colorado, and he was from Egypt, and he found himself very isolated and alone in Greeley, Colorado. Very few people reached out to him. He never had a meal in an American home. He never had a meaningful relationship with an American. He was invited to church once, and he did go. But it wasn't for a regular Sunday morning service. He was invited to a sock hop in the basement of the Presbyterian Church in Greeley, where my brothers both attended while they were students at UNC. And in this basement of this church, he saw young men and women slow dancing with one another and flirting. And he said, if this is what Christianity is about, I'm disgusted. Said Qutb went back to Egypt after a couple of years as an international student with a very bad taste in his mouth about America. He said, America is a place where people do not welcome one another. See, in the Arab world, hospitality is a very high value. I guarantee you, if any one of you were to show up in a city square in any Arab city as an American and be in need, someone would take you in. Someone would feed you, they would give you their best, and they would give you a bed. That is our value in that culture. But here in America, he was not welcomed in. Said Qutb went on to write a book called Milestones. It was the foundational document in an organization which became known as the Muslim Brotherhood, the first modern Islamo-terrorist organization. Osama bin Laden, when asked who was the most important figure in his formation of his ideology named Saeed Qutb, who was an international student in Greeley. Now, I think that we have a huge opportunity that was lost in that situation. We can think about policy and politicians all we want, but if we as individuals don't reach out to the foreigners that are among us, we isolate them. We create hatred for America. So we have to love people. It's not an option. They are here. They're not going anywhere. We're not going to be able to shut the borders. It's not a practical possibility. But we can win them over. And that is our responsibility as individuals. And I believe that if we can get involved with international students, we can actually change the world. And so in our backyard here, there's a university. There's over 3,000 international students there. Hundreds of them are Saudi Arabians. We have an organization called Horizons. We have a building in Boulder. And we do, every other week, we sit down, we have meals with international students. We develop relationships. We develop friendships. And we have an opportunity to change the perspective of these international students who've come to us. They, for the most part today, go home with a favorable impression of America. And I think that is at the root of things like the Arab Spring, where people are hungry for freedom. So my message to you is that if we can remember the things that did make America great, and we can return to those values, that's the only way we can win going forward. So thank you very much for inviting me.